I'm joined today by Colonel Douglas McGregor, and I appreciate him coming on. I want to get down to the truth about what's going on with Ukraine, Putin, this war that we've all been roped into. I believe the mainstream media is misleading Americans with propaganda in order to justify the use of our tax dollars and the military industrial complex. So thank you, sir, so much for coming on today.
Sure, absolutely.
So the first question that I wanted to get down to is who is it that really wants this war between NATO and Vladimir Putin? Because from what I'm seeing outside of CNN and other mainstream media, is it seems like it's the politicians in Washington, D.C. that are more eager to fight this battle through Ukraine against Putin. And it doesn't seem as if the Pentagon is as on board as the politicians. Who's really behind wanting this war?
Well, I think it's clear that the American people are largely divorced from the reality of this conflict, as they have been for the last 30 years, divorced from all the conflicts. War has always been something that happened far away on somebody else's soil. The difference this time is that Washington has decided, along with help and assistance, particularly from its allies in London and the global financial community run out of New York City, to wage war on the Russian state with the goal of not simply regime change, but ultimately destroying the state, potentially dismembering it. And when you look at the people who are advocates for this terrible, destructive policy, they are largely the same people that got us into the Balkans in the 1990s, into Bosnia and Kosovo, and then subsequently were largely supportive of the interventions in 2001 and 3, perpetual warfare in the Middle East, demonizing and transforming into an enemy Libya, Syria, and obviously Iran. This is an old story. It's the same old trope that you've been hearing. It's 1936 again. We have another potential Hitlerian state, and if we don't act, we are appeasers, and the world as we know it will end. So that's about it. But I think there's a lot of money behind this because Russia is full of trillions of dollars of resources, mineral resources, oil, gas, precious metals, agricultural. We just go down the list. There was an attempt in the 90s and in the early part of this century by people from the West, many of whom are connected to organizations like Goldman Sachs and the global financial community, to go in and effectively rape Russia and steal everything they possibly could from it. They were ultimately defeated and thrown out by Vladimir Putin, who established a new regime to bring some more stability and dignity back to the Russian state. He has been talking now for many, many years about the unacceptable policy of advancing NATO to Russia's borders. And he's been warning over and over and over again, if you do this, you will inevitably come into conflict with us. We will not tolerate a large NATO presence. And when you say NATO presence, read the potential for U.S. ballistic and cruise missiles and so forth on the border. And we've taken the position in Washington, that is the political elite, the ruling elite of our country, that Russia is weak, that Russia can be bullied, and all we have to do is apply great pressure. And since we dominate the global financial system, we can isolate it. And this ruling political elite embraces most of both parties. And so we are embarked upon this very dangerous course of conflict and confrontation now with the Russian state and its armed forces. The Washington community that sponsors this has obviously enriched itself over the last 30 plus years through all the various interventions and the massive increases in defense spending. But it actually goes beyond that. It goes to the reconstruction costs, rebuilding costs, and the introduction of U.S. firms and interests into other countries. It's a kind of new imperialism that we've been embarked upon. And Russia is simply the latest target. The problem for the ruling elites in Washington is twofold. First of all, most of them are ignorant of reality. They know nothing about the world beyond our borders. They know nothing about military power. And so they badly miscalculated with Russia. This was a war that should have ended in a few weeks because Russia would collapse, or at least in a few months because Russia would collapse. This is a war that should have ended because Russia can't produce enough ammunition. This is a war that should have ended because of horrendous and horrific casualties taken exclusively by the Russians. And all we have to do is arm this proxy, this Ukrainian force that we built after 2014, once we had established a government in Kiev that would do our bidding. And this force in Ukraine would devastate Russia. Well, it hasn't quite worked out that way, has it? So now we face a very different set of circumstances. But when you ask who is behind it, you've got to look at a whole range of people. And remember that the preeminent goal in Washington for most politicians is to stay in office and continue to enrich themselves. Therefore, they pay a great deal of attention to their donors. Who are the donors? You have to go and look at the oligarchic class of people that drive policy, that keep us in a state of perpetual conflict with a whole range of people and nations. Who are they? Then look at the industries in which they are invested and which support these policies. When you look at those things carefully, in other words, it boils down very simply to follow the money. When you do that, you begin to understand that what's happening in Washington has nothing to do with the American people or United States interests. No one in the United States, very few people in the United States know where Ukraine is. They could care less. And when you ask about NATO, people will say, oh, yeah, sure, that's important, I guess. What is it? This is the problem with just about everything, I think, that's been happening in the United States since the end of the Second World War. Most Americans aren't terribly interested on what goes on beyond the borders of their own country. I mean,